Hi, this is Victorian Lit, the Heavenly Twins, Evadne Part 2. Last we left off that she had received a note from a stranger talking about and informing her about the acts committed by her husband before he was married, things she had a complete unawareness of. She was repulsed by this and refused to live with him as his wife after she found out about this. In a letter she sent to her mother, she says, "Since I left you, I have been fully informed of circumstances in Major Coliquon's past career which make it impossible for me to live with him as his wife. I find that I consented to marry him under a grave misapprehension of his true character, that he is not at all a proper person for a young girl to associate with, and that, in point of fact, his mode of life has very much resembled that of one of those old-fashioned heroes, Roderick Random or Tom Jones, specimens of humanity whom I hold in peculiar and especial detestation for." Page 69. Her father and her mother, as she shared any of her father's views, were very displeased with her, and even more so after becoming aware of the fact that she has ideas that kind of resemble the ones of new women that aren't all that about submission and forgiveness and taking it upon themselves to fix a man. Still, this would be a very bad look for the family, for Evadne, for the husband, Major Coliquon, because divorces were very looked down upon, and there would be a lot of assumptions of what the reason was that Evadne would be so repulsed of the idea of living with him. So this was going to be a bad look for everyone. And as in Victorian age, one of the most important things as a woman was the way you were perceived. It was not going to end up well for any of the people involved and associated with it. But her decision was very strong-willed. It took the vision of her mother bawling her eyes out, on her knees, begging, and having a promise to compromise with Evadne for her to reconsider. The page that puts this into picture is page 87, and an expert goes by this. Evadne broke down. The sight of the dear face so distorted, the poor lips quivering, the kind eyes all swollen and blurred with tears was too much for her, and she flung her arms round her mother's neck and cried, "I consent, mother, for your sake, to keep up appearances, but only that, mother, you promise me. You will arrange all that?" Then Evadne and Colonel Coliquon had an interview and came into agreement of how they were to act in their marriage. And this was basically just glorified roommates. They would live together, they would just do their own part, kind of live individually from each other while in their household, but still keep up appearances, and to everyone else, as everyone else knows it, they would be man and wife. An expert from page 89 goes, "Again, Colonel Coliquon bowed stiffly. 'As you please,' he said. 'My only wish is to please you.' He paused for a reply, but as Evadne had nothing more to say, he was obliged to recommence. 'The regiment,' he said, 'is going to Malta at once, and I must go with it, and what I would venture to suggest is that you should follow when you feel inclined. By P&O, fellows will understand that I don't care to have you come out on a troop ship, and I should like to get your rooms fitted up for you two before you arrive. I am anxious to do all in my power to meet your wishes. I will make every arrangement with that end in view, and if you can suggest anything yourself that does not occur to me, I shall be glad.'" This ended up working pretty well between them both, because in this way, Major Coliquon, now turned Colonel Coliquon, there would not be any rumors of him, and for Evadne, as her father did not accept her anymore and would not bring himself to care for her anymore, she does need someone who would put that roof over her head and would continue to support her, as she cannot support herself as a woman in the Victorian era. The life as a married woman. So Evadne, again, to keep up appearances, attended social events with her husband. She would go from place to place and would act cordial. She was pretty quiet to the people she did meet, but she would get more comfortable as time went on. She met people and achieved a greater awareness for others' attitudes and actions, and was often confused or just surprised by their different attitudes. An example of this is in page 157, where she thinks, "True to her determination to make things pleasant for Colonel Coliquon if possible, and seeing that he found these people congenial, Evadne did her best to cultivate their acquaintance for his sake. Never successfully, however. A mere tolerance was as far as she got, but even that was intermittent, and the undercurrent of criticism which strained through her mind in their presence can never be checked." Page 157. She didn't really like his friends, but as his wife, she attended to them, and because she was in such good terms with Colonel Kalkuan, she would do her best effort to do everything as he would like. Their relationship was that of a good friendship. Therefore, she was less vulnerable to some of Colonel's attitudes and behaviors compared to that of a wife. There are some instances that I'd like to mention where she is appreciative of this fact. She felt her heart fill with earnest self-congratulation. If these are the kind of people whom Colonel Kalkuan prefers, was her mental ejaculation. What an escape I have had. Thank heaven he is nothing to me. From page 159. Kalkuan himself also mirrored this sentiment and grew an understanding about their circumstances and situation and how it flows better than the marriage between a man and wife, because they were treating each other with that respect and kindness that a gentleman and a lady often do so when they do not have stronger bonds. One quote that reflects this is, "The pleasing fact that he and Evadne were getting on very well together dawned on him quite suddenly one day, but it was she who perceived that the absence of friction was entirely due to the restriction which polite society imposes upon the manners of a gentleman and a lady in ordinary everyday intercourse, when their bond is not the bond of a man and wife." Page 107. As they spent a couple of years together, Colonel Kalkuan started to reach that point where husbands start to treat their wives as a little bit more coldly. And although this gradual decline had been very small because of the accordance of their relationship, there is a quote that discusses this change. "The deterioration of Colonel Kalkuan had certainly been delayed by the arrangement which in honor bound him to treat Evadne as a young lady and not as a wife, but that it should set in eventually was inevitable. When it did begin, however, it was less in the manner for the same reason that had delayed it than in pursuits, and therefore Evadne's position was not affected by it, and she continued to have a kindly, affectionate feeling for him, and to pity him, still without bitterness." This quote is from page 256. And it can be seen that their relationship was still pretty solid, and she was still happy to have had rejected him at first, to set those boundaries so she could feel a little bit less affected by his attitudes in her future with him. A husband's wish. After years of marriage, Colonel Kalkuan makes one last attempt to win Evadne over. This carries on to a discussion about if there would be any hope for him left, as Evadne rejected or just reinstated and confirmed that she would never love him. But she did appreciate everything he's done for her and thinks of themselves as very good friends. He asked and wished of Evadne to not act upon any of the new woman ideas that she had been quietly entertaining. The quote goes, "Will you promise me that one thing, Evadne?" he asked. "Promise me that during my lifetime you will never mix yourself up, never take part publicly in any question of the day. It would be deuced ridiculous for me, to have my name appearing in the papers in connection with measures of reform, and all that sort of thing." And Evadne responded, "I promise to spare you that kind of annoyance at all events," she answered, without hesitation, making the promise not because she was infirm of purpose, but because she was indefinite. She had no impulse at the time to do anything, and no notion that she would ever feel impelled to act in opposition to this wish of his. This was in page 261. But as soon as she did make this wish, and she was informed of the experience of Evadne and how she had become ill and her child very ill as well, she began to think and made a decision to throw away any influential books and stay away from any influential knowledge. That is to say, if people would speak to her about the matter, she would kindly ask them to dispose of that conversation and to start a different one. Still, because her brain was so used to acquiring this knowledge and it was so bright, it started to become dull and affect her not just mentally but physically. A quote from page 264 until 265 represents this. Up to this time, Evadne in her home life had been serene and healthy-minded, but now suddenly there became a change. She began to ask, why should she trouble herself? Nobody who had a claim upon her wished her to do anything but dress well and make herself agreeable. And this was the influence under which Evadne entered upon a new phase of life altogether. She gave up reading, and by degrees there grew upon her a perfect horror of disturbing emotions. As her mind grew sluggish, her bodily health decreased, and the climate began to tell upon her. Malta has a pet fever of its own, of a dangerous kind, from which she had hitherto escaped. But now, quite suddenly, she went down with a bad attack and hovered for weeks between life and death. Her husband had died of cardiac syncope, and Dr. Gilbreth then proposes the idea of marriage to her with him. By the end, she agreed, and they moved back home to his house, where he could support her mentally and also physically by having a roof over her head and keeping her distracted. But all of her life experiences, the misfortunes, the debts, and the whole giving up of learning took a toll on her. She became mentally ill, even attempting suicide during her first pregnancy. The experience of that is laid out in page 493. I put my candle down and tore the note open with trembling hands. This is from the perspective of Dr. Galbraith. The first few lines were enough. I am haunted by a terrible fear, she wrote. I have tried again and again to tell you, but I never could. You would not see that it was prophetic, as I do. In case of our death, nothing to save my daughter from Evet's fate. Better both die at once. He ended up reaching her in time when, right as she was about to commit suicide. And after some support and being by her side to continually take care of her, she began to recover mentally. And although she wasn't at her peak and at her best, and she still had some struggles of her own, she shared a left field marriage with Dr. Gilbreth and her 2 kids, Domino and a baby daughter. That was Victorian Lit, the Heavenly Twins, Evadne Part 2, and a lot of people expected a lot from Evadne, as she would show huge signs of intellect and ideas that supported new woman attitudes. But she did not make or did not take the course of a difference as many people expected her to, including one of those of her closest friends. Regardless, she went through a lot, and by the end did end up in a happy marriage and participating in motherhood. So that was Evadne, and thank you for listening.